Hey everybody, good morning. Welcome to turn that music off. Recognizing the holidays for sure with those bells. Hey everyone, good morning. Welcome to or good morning, good evening, good night, as everyone likes to say in the corp world. Depending on where you are. Hope you are having a wonderful week and holidays, winter time is coming upon us, and we're just going to get started with a live stream today. Talk a little bit about going from the idea of a monolithic style application, how that was developed, and all the methodologies and the ways in which you would think about that, to a more microservices focused application, what it looks like, the workflows behind that, the logic, stuff like that. So welcome. Thank you so much for being here. Super excited. Our guest Haven will be on in just a couple of minutes. But before we get started, I just wanted to let everyone know, if you're watching live, go ahead and throw your comments in the chat, the live chat here on YouTube. We'll be keeping an eye on that. As you have questions, throw those out there. We'll jump in. We'll answer those questions as much as we possibly can. We'll have a dedicated set of time at the end of the stream to go through any lingering questions that come up from you or anyone else. Also, if you want to follow along or get your kind of hands-on things, you are always welcome to jump into our Orkes developer playground. Go ahead and click on get out your phone, scan the QR code you see right here on the screen. That'll take you straight to our Orkes developer playground. It's essentially a sandbox for you. You can jump into it, work away, build out workflows, test them, try them, all that good type of stuff. It's totally free, and it's your own namespace that you can play around in. It's really cool. So it gives you a lot of flexibility. And as we go through the stuff today, as Haven is demonstrating some of these things for you, you're always welcome to jump in there and kind of like follow along as much as you possibly could want to. So without further ado, I guess, good way to say that, I'm going to go ahead and bring in our guest, Haven. Haven, how are you doing?
Hey Jeff, I'm doing well, doing well. It is bright and early over here on the West Coast, but we are at work.
Yes, absolutely. And I feel like it's funny because in most times of the year, you being in the Pacific Northwest and me being here in Northern California, like Sacramento area, California, our weather would be pretty different. Like, be a little sunny and all that type of stuff here. May not be quite that way there. Maybe it would be. There are times, obviously, but I feel like right now is the time of year where our weather conditions completely overlap. So it's like still, I think it's 8:02 a.m. Pacific time. It's still dark outside. It was raining all night, all that type of stuff. I'm wondering if it's kind of like the same for you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a nice warm 46 degrees outside right now, which is actually fairly warm for this type of year, or time of year, right?
For all of our friends out there who don't use the Fahrenheit, use Fahrenheit as a scale, yeah, it's pretty chilly. It's 42 degrees here for me in Sacramento, so it's a tiny bit cooler, but it is what it is. Awesome, Haven. I'm going to go ahead and give you a chance to kind of introduce yourself to everyone, what you do here at Orkes, kind of some of your background, and kind of we can get started on this topic. If you want to kind of
Sure.
tell everyone about yourself.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining. My name is Haven King. I am an engineer slash architect here at Orkes. We are a relatively small company, so I wear a lot of hats. I work on our backend team, working on Conductor itself, implementing features. And then additionally, I work with a lot of our customers to actually do these migrations, to implement workflows, to implement microservices within their environments. Prior to joining Orkes, I was at AWS, and I spent a lot of time working in the serverless organization there. So microservices are kind of what I've been doing for the last good number of years. Happy to be here today and talk with all of you.
You can't hear me. I'm sorry. My microphone got muted for some reason. I apologize. Let me back up. Everyone just saw my mouth moving like I was talking about something really important here. See, this is why I love live streaming. You never know what's going to happen. Okay, I will back up a little bit. Before we get into any sort of technical demo. What I was kind of waxing poetic over here to myself about was the idea that, the conversation around moving from a very large, call it monolithic application to a more microservice or a service-based application that's distributed and can be developed and worked on by a variety of different people at the same time and be a little bit more flexible and dynamic. Obviously, it sounds great to be able to do it. It's not in practice easy to do. And, my background comes from, I was, doing developer work at Cisco for a long time. And so you can imagine a lot of the big customers we would talk about in that world have applications, or they work in industries where it's common to have an application that is just a very large, single app that can be developed by a certain set of people that isn't highly distributed. And that's not a negative thing necessarily. It's just that's the classic style that those stacks were built on top of. And so I think to get into it today, one of the things that would be interesting for you to kind of give us some insight on is how a business or a company, in your experience, has even thought about where do we begin with that? Because it can sound like, if I'm going to make this up because I don't know for sure, but like, let's say the DMV, their backend systems probably is not a highly distributed, well thought out, scaled application. It's these classic AS400 or Unix, these huge Unix type, big iron systems, which is fine. But it's not, if you're a developer said, let's move this to this new model, where do you even begin? Like, how do you even bite into that problem to take a step forward?
Yeah, and that's honestly very often the hardest part, is identifying there's a problem and identifying what the steps need to be done to take it to the next iteration of your architecture. Very frequently, it ends up being a lot of business conversation and looking at what your business does and what that actual system is doing today, right? And identifying, okay, today it's a monolith. Today we are doing these different kinds of transactions, these different kinds of operations. How can we break these up into smaller pieces, not even technically, but conceptually, right? You use the DMV example. So there's probably an entire department dedicated to doing scheduling of driver's exams, right? And that itself is probably handled in the same monolithic application as everything else, but the application of the technology, the AS400 of it all, is almost secondary to the fact that you need to identify what you want to break this up into, and then who's going to own those individual components. And that's really the first step, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. So, before we get into any sort of like practical demo to show kind of how a workflow orchestration tool or something like Orkes, something like Orkes specifically, Orkes Conductor, can help with that. Would you mind giving everyone kind of a primer on what it looks like to take maybe, let's say, a piece of that larger application and bring it into a more distributed style of software development?
Yeah, so essentially, when we're looking at a large monolithic application, right, we are very frequently looking at a system that has one way of interacting with it, at least when we're talking about older legacy systems, right? A lot of these architectures do have you call it an SDK, even if it wasn't originally called an SDK for some of these systems, right? A way of interacting with them that you have to take into account. So when we're looking at breaking these out, you oftentimes can't get away from interacting with them via the old school legacy prescribed methodology. Now, what you can do when we're talking about exposing this as a microservice or breaking out into microservices, right? Very frequently, you want to practice iterative design. You want to find the smaller components and break them out over time. You're still going to be using those same archaic ways of interacting with your existing legacy system that you are today, at least for a very long time, depending on how long your migration is going to take. But we're going to go ahead and break out individual components of that. This is often referred to as the Strangler pattern. This is a term that I think arose out of AWS a number of years ago. Basically just the idea of breaking off smaller pieces of a larger service and exposing them individually rather than exposing them all as one big API service, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, you almost have to kind of look at the idea of this is kind of a big topic, but like the BPM, business process modeling, that sort of thing, to kind of, to your point, to kind of like figure out where do you begin, like which of these things do we want to start with first to kind of break out and do that. You have mentioned when you and I have been on calls before the concept of the Strangler pattern, and I think I've looked it up before, but I don't know that I fully understand because my background is not in software development. What could you explain sort of like what exactly that not just what the Strangler pattern is, but kind of more specifically why it is beneficial to use that almost as a model in these situations?
Sure. So at a very high level, and it gets a little bit more involved in this when we start talking about infrastructure and ownership and whatnot. But the example that I'll typically use to illustrate how the Strangler pattern works, or at least how to think about it, is picture you have a monolithic application. Picture you have a legacy system that is serving your business, and there are 100 different things that it can do. Realistically, you'll probably have more than 100. You might have on the order of thousands. And they might not actually be exposed as API endpoints, but for the purposes of this example, picture that you have 1,000 different API operations that you could potentially do, and they're all being handled by this one legacy, this one monolithic application. The Strangler pattern is basically the idea of identifying either a single endpoint as granular as a single endpoint, or more realistically, a small subset of those endpoints that are related and can be moved out to a separate system, right? And identifying, as few as one endpoint, as many as maybe 10 or 20 endpoints that can go ahead and be supported separately. There are various strategies for going and making sure you're hitting the monolith or the microservice that you end up eventually writing. But the Strangler pattern is very largely taking those 5, 10, 20 endpoints, putting them somewhere else, and having those handled by a separate service. And now you still have the monolith, right? This is not an all at once migration to a whole net new system. And very likely you're doing some kind of A/B routing, right? To make sure that you're sending like a percentage of your workflows or a percentage of your load to the new service versus the old one, and making sure that they are consistent. But essentially, the Strangler pattern is doing that and doing that over and over again to break out 5, 10, 20 of your individual endpoints, 5, 10, 20 of your individual pieces of functionality at a time, and to gradually migrate away from the monolith that way, right? Fairly commonly, when we talk about the Strangler pattern, you're going to have some kind of intermediary between your applications and your monolith, so that change between a monolith and a microservice via the Strangler pattern can be largely invisible to applications that are consuming the infrastructure itself, right? But that's generally what we're talking about. That's the kind of evolution we're looking to do when we're looking to modernize some of these older applications.
That makes sense. So you almost kind of present what you end up presenting in the UI, whether that UI is a web page or an interface or whatever it happens to be, is the same visual experience to somebody, but the component behind that is connecting to this piece that you peeled off and kind of are running separately. And you made a comment about like, running piece by piece. It almost gets me thinking of, or it does get me thinking of the concept of like A/B testing, either in marketing or in web design, where you're like, present one style of the interface here to one set of people and a different style of it here that you're testing out to kind of get a sense of like, one, like, is it working for people? Is the flow working for people? Do they visually understand how to interact with it? But then also like, does it work? Can they get into it? And does the service itself actually function the way it's supposed to function, but only for a limited number of people? So it's not breaking. If it's breaking for everyone, it like just affects a smaller group. It sounds kind of similar to that.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And it goes to not just, obviously, you use the UI example, right, of seeing a particular UI component that changes for some people and not for others. When we're talking about these services, whether they be monolith services or microservices or migrating between them, typically we are talking to developers, right? The developers are the ones who are consuming these services in their code, potentially in their infrastructure, right? So they're the ones who need to be aware, or at least cognizant of the fact that this is the kind of failover we're doing, or not failover, but passover, right?
Yeah. I'm kind of curious. So this is a bit of a pivot from what we were just talking about. But like one of the things it gets me thinking about in this general concept is there has to be some kind of an effect. I have to imagine there's an effect on company culture if you're going through a process like this, or if you're going through a mindset, like, because, senior architects, business decision makers may sit back and say, great idea, this is what we need to do, et cetera, et cetera. But that, if you're a small company, it's like a startup like us, it's one thing, but you're a big company that is the more likely profile of a business that is going to be in a situation like this. I have to imagine there's like a whole host of different developers or people working on these back end systems that are going to be affected by this type of shift in design. How have you seen it affect the culture, the actual people working, and like how do they even think about bringing those people with them? Because I have to imagine, or I'm guessing in my mind, that some people are gonna be like, yeah, great idea, no problem. This is just a different way of doing things, no big deal, and we just move on. But I have to imagine there's also a lot of people out there, because we've met them, and this is not a judgment in any way, but there's a lot of folks out there who will see this as a huge shift for them, and they have to almost get out of their own mindset, this like fixed mindset, to think about how to develop code and develop themselves in an environment like that. What have you experienced when you've seen those sorts of things happening on the culture side specifically?
Yeah, on the culture side, what's really neat about a tool like Orkes Conductor, or really a lot of the orchestration platforms out there, is they do often foster a better sense of collaboration between different organizations, between different teams within organizations. And so it very quickly becomes apparent to even people who, I mean, let's be honest, we don't have an esoteric SDK for writing programming languages, or for programming languages for Orkes that you might be experiencing or using in the financial industry, right? To not to call out any in particular. So you might feel out of place if you have to go and write a microservice, or you're being told all of a sudden that you have to use one of the more, not even drastically modern programming languages, but Java or Python, right? But at the end of the day, the ability to collaborate with other teams really does come out as a premier benefit of using an orchestration platform, right? And that's collaboration, not just from a programmer standpoint, right? When we think about collaboration between teams, very often in the microservices world, it's collaboration between services teams. It's your payment service talks to your order service, and there are people behind those processes, but also between operations teams, visibility to business teams, right? Going ahead and helping people just work together better does very frequently foster a better culture in that regard, right?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. When you give somebody kind of everyone kind of a single thing to sort of circle around and learn together and work together. It makes sense that they in large cases they would sort of gravitate towards that. And that is a good point, I think, for us to switch over and give you a chance to kind of demo some of this and show off a little bit of what it looks like to actually bring in a pieces of a larger app into a more microservice or a workflow centric way of building applications. So I'm going to give you a chance to share your screen here. We'll switch that over.
Awesome.
Go for it.
Are we up? My screen.
Oh,
visible?
You are up. Yep, absolutely.
Awesome. Okay, great. So everyone, here is Orkes Conductor, or at least your very first view of Orkes Conductor, right? This is going to be our visual workflow builder. I'll be using the visual workflow builder in most of the demo functionality today, just because it gives you a good idea of what's going on under the hood. However, our SDKs are great. They also support building workflows via code. SDKs are available in Java, Go, Python, C#, JavaScript / TypeScript, and Clojure. So if you wanted to write your workflows in those languages, you could as well. And at the end of the day, it's just a JSON document. But a workflow, or a way to think about a workflow, is just a series of steps, right? Essentially, it's a state machine. It's a state machine that Conductor manages for you so that we can go ahead and say, hey, these are the individual services I want to call. This is the order I want to call them in, and how they interact and pass inputs from one to the next, right? And it's going to have a name, a description, input parameters, just like you might expect a method called in your programming language to do so, except it will be called by and operated by Conductor rather than by your underlying operating system or machine, right? So we're going to give this just some name, and you'll notice it's popping up the names of the other workflows I already have, and some description. Oh, if I can spell. There we go. These can obviously be as descriptive as you want them to be. This is just an example of if you wanted to comment code. In the case of writing applications, you would comment with the description. In the case of building a workflow, to give an idea of what this actually does. Input parameters, pretty self-explanatory. These are names, these are keys. So we would have user ID, or transaction amount, or transaction type. And then finally, optionally, you are able to specify like a JSON schema. So if we wanted to do input and output validation on these, we absolutely could. And this will go ahead and actually provide you with a common interface, if you will, for this workflow, for executing this workflow, which is super useful when we talk about how you actually run this, right? I'm happy to show here, we're going to be able to basically add tasks to this. And again, visual workflow builder, if you want to do it with code, you are more than welcome to do so. But we can basically just go ahead and add individual pieces of functionality. So Jeff, I wanted to ask you for a second, because we have several different pieces of functionality here, right? When we're looking at doing this kind of monolith to microservice architecture, we have a lot of developers writing code, right? And when we're building out these workflows, there's a particular component of this, which is the tasks, right? These are the actual functional pieces. So I guess from your perspective, Jeff, working with the developers, working with the community a bit today, what have you seen the developers that are out there reception to building tasks, reception to working together on this granular level? Is that something that you have a lot of familiarity with?
A lot, no, but familiarity, yes. What I have noticed is that the people that I have spoken to, once they get in and start. Oh, sorry, my cat is trying to get out of my office right now. He has learned to open the door. You can't see it off camera, but I'm hearing my cat is trying to open the door handle to my office right now. So if I seem distracted, I apologize. What I have noticed in the conversations I've been around, either in our Slack channel, which anyone can join, go to orkes.io and you can join our Slack channel there, or in other places, is the idea that once they get into the tool and they understand how to build these flows out, they almost kind of stop needing to look at the other constructs, so they can just focus on what are the individual tasks, what are the individual things I need to bring over, which is kind of neat, because as they do that, and I hear these conversations, it's almost more of a conversation of like, okay, how much further can I break this down? Because I think sometimes, especially people who are like new to building out their application in this way, or like mapping their application this way, they tend to think of a task in almost too many things at once. Like, oh, that task should do these three things. And they start to realize pretty quickly that, like, no, a task, it's almost like somebody like me who's got ADHD. When you're trying to figure out how to take that next step to do something, people tend to say, well, if you're going to go to the gym, just get up and go get in your car and go to the gym. It's like, no. There's like 15 steps between that. Like, I have to stand up, then I got to take a step, and then I got to take another step. And that's almost, I don't want to draw too close to similarity, but it does have a lot of corollaries there, where it's like getting used to what is that very first next step, and then what is the very first thing, the thing right after that, and then what's the thing after that. And it almost introduces a level of additional creativity for people, because they can start to really think about, oh, well, if I can do something at this next piece, well, that means I've got 2 or 3 other options I can do with that piece too. I don't have to just bundle everything together. And it's almost starting to get their minds, to your point, out of, I'll stop using the word in this case, monolith, but out of building big and into building really small. And when they start to realize how small or granular they can create these tasks to be, they start to realize, oh my gosh, I actually have so much more control over what I'm doing at this point in the app development, because this one piece can now break up to this. Now it can break up to this. Oh, you know what? That problem I had a year ago where I couldn't get this one piece to work because it was all bundled together, I can break those tasks up to multiple different components. And I start to see them almost like walking away from the question to like brainstorming together how to make this even more flexible to solve these problems that they didn't think they ever could solve.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think you called out or you mentioned 2 things there, Jeff, that I want to touch on. The first one is decomposing, right? So that's taking a larger process, taking a larger service, and breaking it up to as many small discernible components as you can. In the case of our monolith earlier, with the 100 API endpoints, you might have the 5 or 20 that you break out into individual services, and your workflow can operate on individual API endpoints, but really you should be thinking about what those API endpoints are doing under the hood, what those services are actually operating, what those transactions look like, and go ahead and break them up as much as possible as well, right? Don't worry about state within your own individual services. That's a big tenet of working with Conductor, of working with an orchestration platform, is state is something that is handled for you. Your tasks, your services have inputs, they have outputs, but anything in the middle should be ephemeral as much as possible, right? You will have databases, you will have stores that you need to go ahead and log data to, right? But for the most part, you should implement your tasks in a way that are idempotent as much as possible. But the other thing you touched on, Jeff, is converting things to Conductor, or migrating to Conductor. That's something that absolutely happens, right? You will probably want to at some point write a task, write a service that is made to specifically work with Conductor using our SDKs, using your programming language of choice. Those are going to be worker tasks. These are fairly open ended. You can do virtually anything you want. If you don't like the programming languages we offer, you can implement it using an API, right? However, if you're just getting started in your migration journey, and maybe we're not talking about legacy systems because those are, depending on just how old they are, they might not expose RESTful APIs. They might not be exposed as API endpoints, right? But if you have existing services that you want to integrate into Conductor, bring into your workflow without needing to do a whole bunch of transformative work ahead of time, we make it very easy to, for instance, call one of those HTTP endpoints, right? So this is where we go ahead and say, here's an existing API. This might be an API that you own that is internal to your organization. This might be an API that you interact with, Slack, Stripe, etc., right? That you want to call out to from within your workflow. And we allow you to go ahead and do that without having to write the code. Obviously, this is still a tool for developers. You will write code, and a lot of these services that you own are going to be code based. But the details of like calling an HTTP endpoint is not code that you typically care about writing very specifically, and so we provide that functionality out of the box. Now, for this HTTP task, right, very important to Conductor and to microservices in general is how they communicate with one another, right? If we have this call to a service and we have another call to a separate service, there are so many different ways to have services talk to one another, to have services call one another. There's RPC, whether it's gRPC or other older procedure call frameworks, right? There's message buses, event-driven systems, other systems similar to Conductor. From Conductor's perspective, we implement essentially queues for you. There are managed queues of tasks, right? And you're able to go ahead when you're running a workflow and actually reference the outputs of previous tasks. So here we can say hit this URL endpoint. You already see we've got a string formatting syntax set up here, pre-populate with us. You can go ahead and hit this specifically for the user that was passed into the workflow itself, right? And so now we will hit that API endpoint. And then for the parameters, we might similarly go ahead and take the output of the previous task. So we have this task reference name. We can name this first API call. And in this task, we can go ahead and get the output of that first API call and pass it in as the body parameter. So just like very high level, this is going to be what you'll do when you're building workflows, what customers are doing when they're going ahead and migrating some of these processes. I guess, Jeff, do you have any questions here? Or is there anything that makes sense to you as far as these workflows being built? I saw you stepped away for a second, so I will forgive you
No,
if
you're good.
you didn't quite catch everything I was saying.
No, this is good, and for me, visually, it's neat to see the way in which you're using the builder here, because I know when a friend of mine's a developer, or a head of like an engineering group, and I know that in talking with him, like largely he or his team might spend their time like actually preparing the JSON and just pasting that in, making sure that's what it looks like. But for me, as somebody who like learns and works visually anyway, this builder is helpful, and seeing the way that it's I guess it's beyond seeing how you actually like click through and start a task and what fields to configure. Oh, my camera just dropped for some reason. What's interesting to me is watching like how you choose to create a new task, what step you choose next, and kind of listening to understand why you choose that next task and why you choose to configure it the way that you do. Because that, for a person like me and how I learn, it helps me better understand, oh, that's where you went with this next. Because for me, sometimes if as somebody who's not a developer classically, I'm learning tools and concepts as I go along and get a better understanding so I can empathize with devs as I'm talking with them and our community members. What's helpful for me is to hear and listen for the spirit of when you're building this out and you're thinking about how the flow should go, what are you choosing to do next and then after that? And that, I think that makes a big difference for someone like me, because then when I'm talking to someone else in the future, I get a better sense of like, oh, I think you might have missed a step or misunderstood this one step here. Let's talk about that, because I think that actually might be where your problem is. And for me, as classically a network engineer or systems engineer, that's how I troubleshoot. Like that's how I'm trying to understand how the human thought about how going through and doing their thing usually tells you where there's an issue or a concern far more often than just looking at a log and looking for an error code. You can find errors that way, but finding issues in design for me has always been much more about how does the human who's doing the design or the implementation actually think about what they're doing.
Yeah, and I think that is a huge benefit. I will say, quick caveat: Orkes Conductor, and in particular the workflow builder, the process of building workflows of writing tasks, is going to be something that, by and large, is done by engineers. By and large, is done by programmers, by developers, by architects, right? But I mentioned earlier that Orkes Conductor really does do a great job at fostering collaboration. We are going to foster collaboration with some of the folks like yourself, Jeff, who are maybe less familiar with what this process looks like, with what building this architecture looks like. And so when we're talking about collaborating with potentially operations teams or business teams, right, or even just other technical teams that aren't as familiar with the work that we're actually doing, that's when we hop over to this view. And I apologize, this workflow might be a little scary because it has a bunch of stuff in it we haven't really talked about yet. But this is an example of a workflow that's already executed, right? So we're able to see the states of individual tasks. In the case of a workflow that's been well-formed and has descriptive names for individual tasks, somebody can come in here and, without being the person who built it, without being the person who wrote it, even if it was written using our SDKs, if it was written as code in Java or C#, maybe I'm a lowly developer who uses a language not familiar with what, or not really equivalent to one of those more object-oriented programming languages. So I might not know what the code even is trying to do, but I can come into this view and see for this individual execution of a workflow and really visualize what's going on, right? These green check marks say that these are happy. They executed successfully. There were no errors. And so we can see that for this service, we're running a lot of things in parallel, right? I can see very clearly that these are all happening side by side. I can see particular components of it are running different code snippets. This is a decision branch, right? So we're doing a decision tree to figure out if we need to update an API key. And then a larger decision branch to determine if and when, or if and where we need to send any Slack notifications if this health check failed, right? So someone like Jeff, you would very easily be able to come in and get a pretty good idea of what's going on here just by looking at this diagram without having to worry about the code behind it. And that's a great example of like a collaborative experience, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like the idea of it almost has a feeling of like I don't want to diminish it by saying a monitoring tool, but almost an APM style experience, where application performance monitoring, where you might go in and what you're looking at is to start with is less of, okay, show me with a specific error, pull up a log, let's look at that specific thing. It's you start with what was the experience, what was the flow that was happening, and I'm using the flow in the more capital F flow, like the overall flow of things. You start by looking through the flow of things to see where something may have had a problem so that you can drill into that point, but also get a better sense of where in the flow did this happen? Because that to what you're showing visually here, that makes a big difference in what you actually, if there's a problem or if you need to inject something new, that is what gives you the context to know where is the best place to do this. Because you could arbitrarily just say, you know what, I'm going to do it before all these other tasks because I think that's a good place for it. But when you look at the context of the flow overall, you might realize very quickly that like, oh, if I do that, I'm going to interrupt a lot of downstream things that I did not intend to have happen. So I think the visualizer in this case is really useful for that. It's useful for many reasons, but for me, somebody who's if it's that different sort of persona, it's really helpful to look at it and go, oh, I could click on one of these and then drill into that task to understand what is actually happening here in greater detail than just trying to sort through a list of code or JSON to try to understand where is stuff occurring.
Yeah, I like your call out there that it isn't exactly an observability tool because it's not. It's a workflow orchestrator, it's a service orchestrator, it's a state machine orchestrator, right? But the observability tools, so the observability functionality that comes out as almost a side effect of all of those things, is really powerful. So you mentioned it. I didn't explicitly show it earlier, but you can click onto individual tasks to see even to the level of what are the inputs to this particular task? What is this task producing as its outputs, right? You mentioned logs specifically as kind of a downside, but logging is a very powerful tool, and we have that built into Conductor as well. So if you wanted to emit specific log messages related to a particular task, you can go ahead and view the granularity of individual task log messages without necessarily having to sift through a larger log process that might be part of a long-running process, right? And then additionally, just while we're on the topic of observability, you called out specifically viewing downstream changes, viewing how these affect other parts of your services. And so there are ways to view like the amount of time each individual service within your particular workflow is taken, right? This is super powerful. This is the kind of thing that organizations pay a lot of money for. But thankfully, Orkes Conductor and Conductor can give this to you out of the box to allow your different components, different developers to work together in that same way.
Yeah, that is super helpful. And like when I'm looking at this flow, when I'm looking at this visual way of seeing this, it, for me at least, as a, not necessarily a developer, but I've done system design, I've done network architecture most of my career, which has a lot of similarities to what we're looking at here, even if the tools we're using are different. And as you were talking, you reminded me of something a manager of mine back in my first 6-7 years of my career told me when I came to work on his team as a network analyst. And one of the things he said to me was, learn how to draw good diagrams. He said different words, but like essentially learn how to draw good diagrams that people can look at and understand, even if they're not a technical person, because that's the way that you're going to be very effective at communicating not just the design you're trying to suggest to people, but how to take that next step. And I really tried to embrace that as much as I could, and doing system design, et cetera, and building kind of the pretty pictures so that anyone could look at it and go, okay, I get what you're trying to do here, and they could then ask questions. They could kind of interrogate to a degree, why would you choose to do this here as opposed to do this other thing? And that's a great conversation to have. And I think one of the things for me that's been really useful in looking at this and thinking about it in the context of trying to move from this big system, this monolithic, system that exists almost behind a curtain in some cases that, can't really be broken apart and can't be really worked on very easily without a lot of background knowledge. The visual elements of this tool give you the ability to much more clearly, for somebody who doesn't necessarily understand the journey that they're on, but they're really wanting to try, it gives them a much better way to think about it visually so they can understand, oh, this is what you mean when you say, take this piece out and put it here and then split it up and then do this. Like these other logical steps they might want to take. This gives them a much better representation so they can interrogate, they can ask questions and be like, why would you do this here? Why not do this other thing here?
Yeah, and I want to call out to your point of like the visual nature of this and how it helps you break out those services, right? This workflow, this is your business logic, right? I mean, it's going to be written by a developer, it's going to be written by an engineer probably, but the workflow itself is really the description of what needs to happen, right? It doesn't dictate, for the most part, it doesn't dictate the how, right? Sometimes it does. If you're using API calls, there is some how to that, right? But for the most part, the underlying technology, the underlying actual implementation of what needs to happen or how it happens, right, is not generally part of the workflow itself. Now, what that means is to a business user or to communicate cross-functionally between teams of what your service does, what your service is meant to do, what problems it's solving, you can almost just share the workflow diagram. Now, there will be some other communication, almost certainly, of Slack or Teams or what have you, of like questions, answers, right? The workflow diagram is your business logic. It's the place you start. Now, the individual services in your workflow might be doing drastically different things. They might be running in completely different areas. We have workflows running in, on the extreme example, cross-cloud with with on-premises resources as well, right? And the workflow itself doesn't really care where the individual tasks are running. The workflow itself only cares that they happen at their individual times. But this means you can have teams working together across some radically different domains, right? And that's where the visual nature really comes into play, is to communicate those cross-functional requirements.
Mm-hmm. So I have a question for you on that. Thinking about how to lay these out. And if you don't mind switching your screen back over to the large, kind of the more robust, this example. Okay, so in a scenario where someone is being brought in and or a group is being migrated, the desire is to migrate to this more dynamic application, I can easily see a scenario where someone comes in and says, cool, I'll just build up this big, huge workflow. And what you might step in to look at and go is, okay, hold on a second. The spirit of what we're trying to do here is break up into smaller pieces so that this large application can be broke up into small components that then interoperate with one another. But I could easily see a place where oh, this is fantastic. My business logic's all this. Sorry, business folks, I'm picking on you for a minute, the biz ops folks. But this big long thing, and then what you very quickly notice is that they're essentially and inadvertently recreating the monolith, but into one massive workflow. I'm sure that is not an uncommon scenario, and it's through no fault of their own. When you come from an environment where culturally and historically that's how you work and that's what you build, it's what you know and it's what your brain is comfortable with, and those pathways are your neural pathways are going to take you back to just building the thing that you're comfortable with. So in those scenarios, how do you typically have a conversation with them or discuss with them the ways in which to think about breaking that up into these smaller components that then work together with each other?
Mm-hmm. Well, let me start by just clicking this little fit to screen button, which will zoom out to show this entire workflow, just to give you an idea of how large this actually is. And then now I will say, now that you see this workflow and you have an idea of this might look a little long or a little large to you, this is actually not a super complex workflow. We do have customers that are building out workflows with hundreds of steps, right, that potentially do become very unwieldy. And when we're talking to those customers, very commonly the prescription is, as you can probably intuit, break it up, right? We didn't really talk about this yet, but very commonly in Orkes Conductor, when you want to do a particular set of functionality, so in this example, we're doing 2 API calls. Let's add a third API call, right? And let's say these are service 1, service 2, service 3, and these are 3 APIs that I'm going to call together. These APIs are almost always called together, right? They are very, very frequently followed by whatever logic this team might want to do. So if we wanted a conditional execution afterwards for some other tasks, maybe some team has a workflow like this, and maybe some team has a workflow where instead of the switch, they do 10 different things in parallel afterwards, right? Different teams might have different processes, but they all call these 3 same workflows one after another to get the same information every single time. Super common within Conductor is we do have the concept of a sub workflow. This is breaking workflows out and calling them from one another. So you can go ahead and if we add this sub workflow here, and let's just for now get rid of our API calls that we're performing, we can then go ahead and choose a different workflow that we want to run at this point instead, right? So we can go ahead and say, run these 3 HTTP tasks, and it'll even provide you with the input parameters that those tasks require to function. And then if you wanted to visualize what that's actually doing under the hood, you can expand it here as well to see that we're making those same API calls. But now we're doing so in a way that anyone in the organization can make this same functionality, can call this same sub workflow as it is within their workflows, within their processes. And I'll pass it back over to you in a second, Jeff. I want to mention just really quickly something that we haven't really talked about yet, but especially in larger organizations, role-based access control is super critical. So you're able to do things like give everyone within your organization the ability to view this workflow and potentially execute it within their own, but not modify it, right? So now you can have these as reusable components across your organization of what different service interactions might look like, right?
And that it's I'm glad you mentioned that last part, because that gets, as I'm thinking more about this and trying to learn on the fly about how services are developed and how you even think about it, what you just described and what you showed in this example is very much getting to the spirit of building out smaller services to accommodate things. And if you have, and actually it gets to the spirit of what software development's really all about and automation's all about, is if there's a thing that is repeated, build an automation for it. Make it its own thing so that it can just be called over and over again, so someone doesn't have to recreate the reel every single time. And what you just did on the fly there, this little sub workflow that can just exist, that anyone can just call and instantiate however they need to, whenever they need to. That's exactly what you want to do. That's why I can imagine this workflow that looks like it has all these kind of bluish gray blocks in various places throughout the flow. And if you looked at the actual flow and what itself is doing may only be like 3 things, but it's calling these other things like pull this piece of data in, pull this in, pull this in, then do your 2 steps, and then you move on, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah. Absolutely. And you mentioned it, reusability, but not just reusability, but also evolution, right? Like the microservices are great for a lot of reasons, but one of the biggest is they make it very easy to just itenerate on your needs, iterate on your business practices, iterate on your technologies, right? And so from a sub workflow perspective, just as an example, I can go open this sub workflow, modify it if I wanted to add another task. Let's say we want to add a JDBC task to make a transformation in a database, right? We can go ahead and add this. And now, if we save this, anyone who's consuming this workflow will automatically have our new behavior. I'll have to refresh the screen so it shows on this new page. But now we're going to see that we have that database call. Teams can iterate, teams can build on these workflows without having to necessarily worry about what the service is doing under the hood. There are concerns about breaking compatibility, of course, right? There always are in software, and there are ways around that. This allows you to really just develop and build together as an organization so much faster.
Yeah, you're reminding me of 2 examples, and then we'll kind of take a pause for any final tips from you, and then any other questions we want to get to. There's two examples, and they're very short stories. It could be longer. One, years ago, I remember watching, or someone sent me a video of the engineering or VP of engineering from Spotify on stage at a conference talking about microservices and the idea of how Spotify as an application is built in the desktop app, and was answering questions about how, like, he's like, hey, you see search up there, your little search box in your Spotify window. Sorry if anybody out there who uses something other than Spotify. I spend all my time on Spotify. But you see the little search box in the upper corner, and he's like, that's like 6 different applications. He's like, every screen you go to in Spotify that has search, it's a different search application. And there's a larger group that works on search, and within it is like 5 or 6, whatever the number was, 5 or 6 different teams that each work on their own search application that all have to connect together so that visually and from a user experience perspective, it feels like one thing. It's just search, but it's like every single page you go to that is a different page or a different visual interface in Spotify. Whenever you're doing it at that point, the search box there is a different service from the previous page that may have to operate slightly differently because of what you're doing on that page or in that view. And it always stuck with it. He mentioned many other examples, but that piece always stuck with me as how nuanced you can be when you're building out an app or evolving an app. And it gives you, yes, it can sound complex on the surface, especially in the context of a discussion like we're having today around going from this big, 1984 style, like big, huge box that's over here that's a black box and we don't know what's inside of it, but we got to break it out, to the most highly dynamic Star Trek style environment that exists out there. But it's not binary. It's a spectrum. Like there's all kinds of stuff that's in the middle as people move closer to that, and you never really get to that end point. You land someplace in the middle, and I have to imagine especially for classical systems like maybe a government or an education or a healthcare system, in many cases the goal is not ever to get completely out of the monolith. It's get as much as you can into a more dynamic environment, because there's some things that, because of how they were developed and thought about originally, you won't be able to. And it's not about get everything migrated, sort of like in the whole idea of the cloud migration from X number of years ago. The idea should have never been move everything off-prem into the cloud. It's move what makes sense and work back and forth collaboratively, unless you were completely born in the cloud, and it's a different story. But I like the concept that we're kind of describing here, because it helps for people who are trying to get their head around how to do this, that the goal isn't this or that. It's someplace in the middle that makes sense for your environment. And over time, to your point, with things like sub-workflows and other conceptual or logical components, you can evolve pieces and pieces over time to get closer to what your ideal state happens to be, which is interesting, which is really cool. And actually, a question just came through from Mayank. Hopefully I'm saying your name right. Let me throw that up on the screen real quick. I'm going to switch off of your screen share and bring his question up. He actually has 2 questions. The first one is, how do you define boundaries of each microservice? And then the second one is how to deal with shared functionality currently within a monolith.
Yeah, great questions, both of those. I think I can talk very quickly on the defining boundaries of each microservice, right? We've already showed sub workflows, which lets you reuse behavior. In addition to reusing behavior, there's always the concept of how do you share behavior, right? And while I didn't really show it, we talked a little bit about role-based access control as well. You can use those to share essentially control the access to your workflows, control the access to individual tasks using individual tasks, individual workflows, as well as tags. So you can tag a whole collection of workflows, a whole collection of tasks, and have that defined as a shared piece of functionality for your teams. I think there's also the question underlying here, which maybe is what you're asking towards as well, as like from an infrastructure perspective, like how do we define the boundary of what is actually running each of these tasks, right? That's up to you. We have frameworks, we have best practices for how you deploy your services, how you deploy your workers to run with Conductor. But at the end of the day, they can operate in virtually any manner. And so very commonly, you might define your boundaries of your microservice based on the business need and still have it service 5, 10, 15 tasks in a single discrete infrastructural component, right? Lots of different ways we can handle that. That very typically does come down to, hey, let's have a conversation about your specific need, right? Which happy to do, maybe not on this call or on this meeting, but we can definitely have those conversations. The second one, how to deal with shared functionality currently in a monolith system, that's going to be very similar to the first answer, with a little bit of a caveat that I can give maybe an example of the way I've seen some people deal with that in this orchestration platform is you can still call your monolith endpoints, right? I mean, you will have, like Jeff is saying, legacy applications, legacy systems that you still have to interact with, and deploying basically an intermediary or a gateway service for your monolith that exposes that functionality up through Conductor and allows you to make use of all of these sub workflows and role-based access control. And we didn't really show some of the other functionality, but things like task retries for transient failures or timeouts or rate limiting, right? You can build all of those out with Conductor and have that gateway service just provide access to your monolith, access to your legacy system via an orchestrator such as Orkes Conductor, right?
Awesome. Thank you for that, dude. Mayank, thanks for asking the questions. Hopefully those are answers that were helpful for you. If you have other questions, definitely let us know. With about 8 minutes left before we wrap up for the day, my big question for you, Haven, is: are there any sort of tips or tricks or like hidden gems that you might want to bring up and show or talk about that can help in these scenarios, or just whether it's a an actual feature or more of a mindset to look at, like, hey, just keep an eye out for this that could actually help in these scenarios? Anything else you would like to share before we wrap up?
Yeah, we didn't talk a whole lot about the distributed nature of microservices and of orchestration in general, but that is really a super key benefit to Conductor, to orchestration, to microservices, and it's something that allows you to build out, or it's something that orchestration patterns will generally let you build out fairly easily. So just food for thought, if you hop into the developer platform, if you go and start looking at your existing business processes and thinking about how I can migrate these to microservices or some orchestration pattern, every time you're looking at a service, think about, does this need to run before the other service actually does? And if not, throw it in a fork join. You have built-in distributed capabilities without having to worry about doing things like handling thread concurrency or handling resources, right? And there are other ways to do concurrency and to do distributed applications, but having this built in for you is something that I would always consider thinking about when you're going to when you're going to migrate a monolith to a microservice or a legacy application to something a little bit more cloud native, right?
Awesome. That's fantastic. Well, listen, dude, I really appreciate having you on. This is really good. And this, for everyone watching right now, this stream that you're all on, I really appreciate you all being here. And thanks for registering in advance. The stream will become live for others out there rather than having, like a recording link that comes out. This will be shared, and so everyone watching us in Team Replay, catching us in a few days live, you'll find this on YouTube, and we have more events coming in the near future. But as we wrap up, Haven, I just want to say thank you for being here, man. I really appreciate it. I know it's kind of early on the West Coast for us both, but it's a good time to catch for everyone out there who can watch live. And in the future, hopefully we'll get more questions that come in. And we'll bring some more questions from community members. But I think there's a lot more here we can break up. I know one of the other story that I had thought about, but this will be really for another time, is there's a community member and company out there that uses the open source version of Conductor, and almost the nature of their business is essentially creating these workflows and these decision trees that are massively complex, almost like massive spaghetti, because of exactly the business that they run. That's what it needs to be. And they almost, in conversations with them, there's almost no way they could have done that effectively. And they were struggling before until they moved into the Conductor world, where they had this ability to create all these different ways of calling different services to ask questions. This is a pharmaceutical industry thing, checking for safety amongst medications and things, and it can be very, very complex. So it's an interesting end of the spectrum in that conversation to learn about how, to your word, how distributed these things can be, and how distributed the tasks and the flows and what each piece is doing can be. So I think that will be a really good conversation for another time. But anyway, Haven, thank you for being here, man. Really, really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right, buddy. Have a great rest of your day. And I'm going to switch over real quick to our outro here, just to say thank you, everyone who's watching live. Really appreciate you being here. If you haven't already tried it out, I'll give you the QR code again. Here's our QR code for our developer playground. You can just scan that. It's on your right, my left. The QR code here on the screen, you can just scan that right now, or go to orkes.io and you'll find it under the, I believe under the developer menu, you'll find the playground link there. You can jump in, play with your own namespace in that sandbox. It's fantastic, gives you a lot of flexibility. And in the docs, we have all kinds of templates you can play around with. If you want to deploy a template or an example application, you can absolutely do that on your own to really get a sense of how to use this. You can also join us in Slack or in Discourse if you want to join in the conversation on a daily basis. So lastly, just thanks again, everyone. Hope to see you on the next stream. We got the U.S. holidays coming up, holidays for others as well, the Christmas holiday, New Year's holiday, etc. So we won't have any more content, live content for the next couple of weeks, but starting back in January, we'll have at least 2 to 3 different live streams going on throughout the month, plus various events that are occurring out there. So we hope to see you soon. Have a great rest of your day, and we will catch you in the new year. Thanks, everybody.